Welcome back, guys, to From Darkness to Light for part two of our series of sins of avoidability. If you missed the last video, in the last video, I introduced the topic of avoidability versus uh, inevitability. The common view is inevitability. In other words, every person is 100% guaranteed going to sin according to the Bible. Every person that ever lives will, in fact, sin against God. It's guaranteed. Uh, the doctrine I'm proposing here and arguing for is what I'm calling the avoidability, sin being avoidable. Uh, a person could not sin. Okay. In the last video, I just merely introduced that topic. If you missed it, check it out and catch yourself back up here. But I think it's vitally important to watch these videos in order. So, assuming you've watched part one, we're going to move right along. And just a reminder again, we're talking about mainly Romans 3:23, but there's other scriptures. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Does this indeed teach that every individual, young boy, girl, oldest person alive, every single individual on earth to have ever lived and ever will live, is Romans 3:23 teaching that they will in fact sin or have sinned? So that's the angle I'm coming at here. We're going to be examining Romans 3:23 at that angle, the popular view of inevitability. Is this indeed true? So we talked about what sin is, and again, I'll state it at the beginning of this video. My belief is this. It's on the screen here. I'm convinced that sin, being taught as unavoidable or inevitable, is actually damaging to the gospel for these reasons. And I want to show again that sin is not promised or guaranteed in anyone's life according to the Bible when it is rightly divided. And so we'll jump right into it here. This video will be dedicated to the proof text, or the supposed proof text, that is, for inevitability from Genesis up to the time of Solomon. Okay. So if you read the Bible, the way I'm coming across this, if you read the Bible chronologically and you ask yourself if it is true that the Bible does teach inevitability, where in the Bible has this doctrine where was it first began? And so we're going to go all the way back to Genesis here. This is Genesis chapter 3. It's the curse of man. And I have it briefly summarized here. You can check it out in Genesis chapter 3. But from my reading of Genesis chapter 3, the curse of man is that they'll receive pain in the childbearing. There's going to be a struggle to work, to produce food, to make a way of life, and they're banned from the tree of life. There is nothing of sin being promised or guaranteed in their offspring. Okay, so moving right along. You guys can all check these scriptures out. Genesis chapter 6, verses 5 through 6. It says God saw the works of man, it repented in his heart. In 8:21, he saw that they were evil from their youth. You can look that word up. You can check me on all of this. Youth means an age of adolescence or young adulthood. Now, this is where it's important to make this statement. This must always be in your mind as I'm going through this. My case is simply against inevitability and for avoidability. And so seeing 100% of humanity sin, this is important you don't miss this. Seeing 100% of humanity, every individual sin, is not a proof for inevitability. Because if that were so, we could go back to Adam and Eve, 100% of humanity at the time, every individual on earth sinned while they were in perfect Eden. And they did not have a sinful nature or an inevitability to sin in them. If they did, God is the author of sin. They could have not sinned, and yet 100% of them did. And we cannot conclude simply because of everyone sinned that they had to sin or that it was guaranteed they would sin. That is not correct thinking. That's illogical. So remember, my case that I'm making is strictly against an inevitability to sin, not the possibility. It is still possible. The existence of sin to any degree. Remember this. Keep this in mind or you're going to misunderstand my whole argument here in this whole series. My case is against inevitability, not possibility. The existence of sin to any degree, or even strong temptations to sin. That's not what I'm coming against. Even the case, the possibility of absolute universal sinfulness, or every single individual sinning, that's still possible under my views. Okay, so don't miss this. Therefore, its existence is not proof of inevitability. For example, using the argument like that, it's like if you had a dice and you rolled it one or two times and it landed on one or both times, and then because of that, you conclude that it could not have possibly landed on 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6, and so on. Basically, the case of one possibility being so does not eliminate the possibility of the others having been so. Okay, so keep that in mind. Everybody sinning does not prove that everybody was inevitably going to sin. Okay, so moving on through Genesis. These scriptures in Genesis 6 and 8, they indicate that mankind developed into this state. It says that there came a point in time that God saw this. So this is a statement of fact of the time, and prior to, there is no reason to describe people in the Bible with no recorded sin, such as Abel, Seth, Enoch, and so thus far through the Bible, there is no indication of an inevitability to sin. So we're just moving through the Bible from beginning to end and seeing where, if so, this idea of inevitability for everyone to sin came into the Bible. Where is it first mentioned? And again, do not miss this. There is sin. I'm not denying that. There's a lot of it. There is sin. But the inevitability of the sin, again, can't be proven by the sin, because sin is still possible under avoidability. So evidence that is coherent with two conflicting views doesn't prove one or the other. Okay. Remember the Adam and Eve case. It's a very important case to remember for that idea. Okay, so moving out of Genesis, there's nothing there that to my knowledge, that would prove inevitability. We're going to move into Exodus through the Mosaic Law. And one thing that people will come against the idea of avoidability would be the generational curses. In Genesis chapter 20, it's again in Deuteronomy 5:9. God says he's the Lord thy God. He's a jealous God. He's visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me. Now, I have the statement here. This definitely does not mean that God imputes or transfers the sin itself into the offspring's life. This would contradict many other scriptures, and for the sake of time, in this video, I haven't included them, but I will cover them later. I'll mention them briefly here. Ezekiel chapter 18 is a big one. It means that this generational curse, again, it doesn't mean that sin gets transferred into the offspring's life, but I would propose it means that the bad circumstances or the suffering caused by the sin is inflicted on them. Okay, so far through Genesis, through Exodus, through the law, there is no indication in the Bible that sin is in fact inevitable or guaranteed in every individual's life so far. Okay, so moving on through the Bible, we're going to come to a verse here, several verses actually, that seem to be a foolproof case against avoidability. The first one is 1 Kings 8:46 and 2 Chronicles 6:36. I put them together because 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles is actually an account of the same event. And so this statement here at the top, there is no man which sinneth not, that's actually one occurrence in history, one statement really. The Bible gives two accounts of it, okay? And that was Solomon speaking. The next one is Ecclesiastes 7:20. Same writer, same person, Solomon. There is not a just man upon earth that does good and doesn't sinneth not. Okay, so how could you possibly come against this verse to teach avoidability, the fact that somebody could not sin their entire life? Here's my answer. If we go back to those verses, those are the only cases of such statements. Those are the only places in the Bible such statements are made. There's not a just man upon earth that does good, doesn't sin. Those verses. And what I've put here is all these verses that seem to go against that idea. Okay, so if you see in the red, These are all written by Solomon, the same person. Solomon said that there is a man that does good in his sight. Okay, but to the sinner. So he contrasts a person that does good in God's sight to a sinner. He says there's somebody that's good before God. He says there's somebody that pleases God, but the sinner. Okay, so you see Solomon's constantly making this distinction between a pleaser of God and a sinner. 729, Ecclesiastes 7:29, God made men upright, but they sought out many inventions. Okay, that doesn't sound like inevitability to me. Ecclesiastes 8:12, though a sinner do evil 100 times, his days be prolonged, yet surely I know it shall be well with them that fear God. So you see that distinction again, constantly being made by Solomon, same guy that said there's not a just man upon earth that does good and doesn't sin. 9:2, I mean, you could just go on and on with all these scriptures, the righteous, the wicked, the good, the sinner. Ecclesiastes 12:13 through 14, again, think about this. If Solomon's saying sin's unavoidable, and he's also saying here in Ecclesiastes 12:13 through 14, the whole duty, the whole conclusion of his whole statement, Ecclesiastes, his whole work, is this: fear God and keep his commandments. This is the entire duty of man. What's the point in saying this if sin is inevitable? He says again, God shall bring every work into judgment, every work, with every secret thing, whether it be good or evil. Okay. Now Solomon also wrote these. We can go on and on. Again, the same concept: the upright, the perfect, versus the wicked and the transgressors. The perfect and the wicked, the upright, the transgressors, the righteous, the wicked, the sinner. Him that is upright, a pleaser of God, and a sinner. Against sinners and the righteous. These are two completely different kinds of people that Solomon is keeping separate in his mind. I mean, it's obvious. Okay, so going back to Ecclesiastes 7:20, there is no man which sins not, or the accounts in the First Kings and Second Chronicles. What I've shown here is that those verses are an irregular statement of Solomon. They're irregular. It's an oddball, so to speak. What he most often argues for is righteousness versus a sinner, and that a righteous person is not a sinner. Otherwise, all those statements I just showed you doesn't make any sense. And so it's really only one instance. Like I said, First Kings and Second Chronicles, those are really only one instance of the same things because they're two accounts of the same event. So really, there's only two instances in the Bible of this outlying idea that there's not a just man upon earth that doesn't do good and doesn't sin. It seems to be an all-inclusive thing, teaching inevitability. But this is what you need to think about, are we supposed to take these few outlying verses and take them and defeat all of the plain meaning of the many, all those verses I just showed you? I think there was 10, 15, maybe 20 verses I just showed you that teach that there's a difference between a sinner and a righteous person. Are we supposed to take those 1-2 verses and just completely throw out the plain meaning of all those other verses by the same author? I'll remind you. You see, we got to be honest with what the word is saying and inspect the irregular statements in light of the many regular ones. The regular statements are supposed to help us interpret the irregular, not the other way around. Solomon clearly makes all these plain statements that some people are not indeed sinners. Okay. So when Solomon said that there is no man which sins not, he said it in light of the evil generation he personally witnessed. Okay, so to apply this verse beyond its contextual bounds in such a way that Solomon was making a claim about every individual on earth of all times with no exceptions, it's a clear contradiction to the many scriptures that speak of obedient people by the same author again. And there's so many others in the whole Bible. Just wouldn't have the time to show you. Solomon's words, when considering all scripture, are clearly either, okay, so there's not a just man upon earth that does good, doesn't sin. His words there are clearly either, in my mind, they're either an over-exaggeration of a general truth, or they're literally true to that time alone. So the bottom one is much less likely in my mind. I don't think he was saying that there was not a person on earth that doesn't sin, literally. He was over exaggerating the general truth. And when you interpret those verses in light of all the verses I just showed you, it makes perfect sense. Any interpretation beyond that sets the scriptures at odds with one another. So why would why would Solomon say everybody sins in Ecclesiastes 7:20, and then immediately after that, in the same book, why is he making this distinction between a righteous person and a sinner if everybody's a sinner? You see, it doesn't make sense. He was just making an over exaggeration of a general truth that he was observing in his society. There's not a just man upon earth that doesn't do good, that does good and doesn't sin. Like I was saying, it must be an over exaggeration of a general truth. Because just 5 verses down, Ecclesiastes chapter 7, he speaks of a man that pleases God. Okay, so think about this. Can you possibly be pleasing God and not doing good? That's what verse 20 says. There's not a just man upon earth that does good. Is it possible to please God, not do good, and be sinning at the same time? Of course not. No. Solomon's obviously making an over exaggeration there. Okay. So moving on, as you can see by now, I'm going to continue to argue that there's many scriptures that seem to prove inevitability. They're taken out of the bounds of their original context and the limitations and the obvious intentions of the statements in the Bible. The context is very important. Inserting today's popular presuppositions like sinful nature, being born a sinner, indwelling sin, original sin, things such as that, inserting that into the biblical writers' minds, it can make it seem that they did argue for inevitable sinfulness in all human persons. But, like I'm saying, we must constantly ask and honestly answer, what would have been the author's intent in light of what we knew they would have known? What reason? I mean, when Moses wrote Genesis, he didn't have Romans 3:23. When Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes, he didn't have Romans 3:23. Okay, so that's really the main source people come from for inevitability is Romans 3:23, but they didn't have that. So what reason would the biblical authors have to say that every person is a sinner and they're going to sin? And I'm making the case they did not have any reason to believe such a thing. And again, they did. There was sin in their generations. They did observe it. There was much sin. But again, the fallacy that people can have when they're hearing this is they'll say that, Eli, I've never met a person that hasn't sinned. I haven't either personally. Okay. But that does not prove that everybody that sins was inevitably going to sin. I still believe that sin's a possibility, even a strong possibility. But the simple problem I have with inevitability is if sin is inevitable, you cannot possibly avoid it. And then God could not be just and hold you accountable for that which you have no ability to avoid. Okay. So that concludes this video. We moved through Genesis to Solomon. Again, what I'm doing is just going from the beginning of the Bible to the end. I'm covering all the proof texts I'm aware of for inevitability. If you have some that I missed from Genesis to the time of Solomon, let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching this video, and we'll pick back up, as you can see here, in Job, and we'll move along through the Old Testament. We'll look at these cases in the Bible where it seems that sin maybe is inevitable. Maybe everybody is going to sin and they can't help it. Okay. I think you see where I'm going with this. If you like it, please like, subscribe, and join back for part 3. Amen.